Now, if you've been online in the last few weeks and you've made any kind of comment critical of Israel and its actions in Gaza, or even the most innocent comment supporting the Palestinians and the Palestinian cause, there's a near to 100% chance you've been called an anti-Semite. Now, there's a reason for that. It's deliberate. Because Israel and its allies want you and want us all to think that if you criticize Zionism, the ideology, if you criticize Israel, it means you're criticizing all Jews, which makes you an anti-Semite and probably Hitler's second cousin, once removed. This could not be further from the truth, of course. Simply put, and this is important because we tend to use the word Jew and Zionist interchangeably around here, Judaism is an ancient religion, thousands of years old, while political Zionism is an ideology and not even 200 years old. Not all Jews are Zionists, and interestingly, not all Zionists are Jews. Now, the history of modern Zionism starts with a Jewish Austro-Hungarian journalist called Theodor Herzl, who in 1897 wrote a pamphlet titled Der Judenstaat, which means the Jewish state, and that led to the foundation of the World Zionist Organization. Now, Herzl's an interesting character. He didn't speak Hebrew, he barely knew anything about Jewish culture or religion. But that's okay, because it wasn't religion that inspired him as much as it was nationalism. And to understand that, we must understand the times he lived in. This is the time when nationalism is peaking in Europe and the colonial projects are in full swing around the world. This is, of course, the same nationalism that will ultimately culminate in World War II. Now, with so many peoples in Europe and in his own country, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, seeking their own little ethno-states, Herzl decided that, hey, the Jews should do the same. Now, Palestine wasn't his first choice. He even considered Uganda as a possibility, along with a couple of other options, which again goes to show that he wasn't really motivated by religion as much as he was motivated by nationalism. Eventually, of course, they settled on Palestine. But there was another motivating factor: anti-Semitism in Europe. Now, that's a polite term to cover a wide variety of mass murder, vilification, targeting and ostracization of the Jewish community in Europe. This started literally from day one, when the Jews were accused of being Christ killers. During the Crusades, the Crusaders targeted the Jews as much as the Muslims. Everything from economic downturn, bad weather, to the Black Plague was blamed on Jews, and tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, were massacred over the years. This dark history, of course, inevitably culminated in the Holocaust. Now, here's the thing with Herzl. His idea was that, hey, the best way to stop anti-Semitism and persecution in Europe of Jews was if all the Jews simply leave Europe. Now, Herzl and his allies realized that in this project, they wouldn't just get support from the Jewish community, but also from the vast majority of Europeans who hated the Jews and wanted them gone. So it's one hell of an unholy alliance. In his pamphlet, he himself wrote that, and I quote, "Christians who want to get rid of Jews would also contribute to the immigration fund for European Jews." So ironically, we find that right at the outset, Zionists and anti-Semites became allies, and that, by the way, continues to this day. Now, but the only problem is that the Zionists couldn't get this done without the support of a major world power. So lo and behold, in steps British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour. In 1917, Balfour writes a letter to Lord Walter Rothschild, a prominent and very, very rich Zionist, stating that His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment of a national home in Palestine for the Jewish people. History, of course, remembers this as the infamous Balfour Declaration. Only problem is it didn't really make sense. Why would Balfour do this? Because in 1917, Zionism was a small fringe movement which did not even have the support of most European Jews. I mean, most European Jews, in fact, consider them nutcases. Some, in fact, even considered them blasphemers. There's a sect of Jews, which is still active today, that believe that the foundation of Israel is, in fact, a violation of the commandments of God, but that's a whole other story. Now, the strongest opposition to the Balfour Declaration came, interestingly enough, from the British Jew community. And Edward Montagu, the only Jewish member of the cabinet at that time, was bitterly opposed to it. But that's not all. Balfour himself was a devout Protestant Christian who absolutely hated Jews. So much so that just a little while before the declaration, he had sponsored a bill preventing persecuted East European Jews from fleeing to England. So why did this happen? One reason, of course, as always, is realpolitik. Remember that at this time, Russia, the Russian Empire, was trying to expand its influence in the Levant. This is the area of Israel, Lebanon, and so on and so forth. And Britain obviously didn't want that. Now, it was also clear that the dying Ottoman Empire, no matter how much you propped it up, would not be able to stop Moscow. And so Balfour was like, what do we do? So he started arguing for a Jewish state, naturally populated by Europeans mostly, allied to the West, which would prove to be an effective forward base and a stumbling block towards Russian expansion. Of course, in doing so, Britain also betrayed the Arabs who had allied with them against the Ottomans. But, you know, if you even do a cursory study of British history, you'll find that they're not called perfidious Albion for nothing. And of course, the importance of oil was now becoming evident, so that was also certainly in Balfour's mind. And yeah, if you're thinking all of this sounds familiar, yeah, that's probably because it is. The more things change, the more they stay the same. But that's not all, and here's where things get really interesting. Balfour was a Christian Zionist. Because in Europe at that time, there was a widespread belief that the Messiah, the second coming of Christ, would not happen until the Jews had returned to their homeland. Now, this belief, you can find this belief in the literature, poetry, discourse of the time. So in one way, in Balfour's mind and in the minds of his fellow devotees, this was a step towards fulfilling prophecy. Now, you can imagine the kind of high that gives you. Interestingly enough, that belief continues to this day, and one of the many reasons for America's unstinting support for Israel is that a vast amount of evangelical Christians, a very motivated and very united political group, many of them, in fact, prominent politicians, some of them are in power right now, believe the very same thing. Netanyahu knows this and plays to it, referring as he did in a recent speech to fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah, which is about cleansing the land of infidels to ensure the return of the Messiah. Of course, Christian Zionists also believe that when the Messiah comes, he'll cleanse the land of the Jews, but I guess that debate will have to wait until that day actually arrives. In the meantime, we keep playing Messiah games. Now, back to the 1900s. Migrations to Palestine had begun some time back, but now they increased in scale. And once the Zionists were entrenched, they turned to terrorism. Groups like Irgun, the Stern Gang, and Haganah, many of them who had been trained by British sympathizers, some of them in the British Army, turned their guns not only onto the Arab natives, but also onto the British, who had in fact mandated their state's existence. They bombed the King David Hotel. Some people refer to it as, in retrospect, as the 9/11 of that time, and were even, according to MI5's own records, planning to send a team to England to assassinate the British Prime Minister, IRA style. That's because they weren't happy with the pace of events. Now, the leaders and foot soldiers of these groups eventually took leading positions in Israel, in the government, in the military, in the bureaucracy, and then, of course, followed the Nakba with its expulsions and massacres. That's a topic for another day, but it's very well known. Over time in Israel, you've seen something else happen. Nationalism has combined with increasing religious extremism, particularly obviously among the settlers in the West Bank and so on and so forth. People like Rabbi Meir Kahane and his followers carried out numerous massacres of Arabs, for example, in the Cave of the Patriarchs, and also targeted Israelis who don't seem radical enough. Their most prominent target? Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister who was involved in a peace process with the Palestinians, was assassinated by a Jewish fanatic, Yigal Amir, who was opposed to such efforts. Today's Israel, if you can believe that, is more extremist than ever, and honestly, given their record, that's really saying something. Today's Zionism, the best definition that I found is from Dr. Alan Sabrowski, who says that it's a witch's brew of xenophobia, racism, ultra-nationalism, and militarism. It doesn't take much foresight to know that when you have a combination like this in a state which has nuclear weapons and the unstinting support of the most powerful capitals in the world, this is not going to end. We know that ideologies like this do eventually consume themselves, but not before they've shed rivers of blood.